Hola, buenas tardes. Hoy tenemos como invitado a Jason Steinhauer, que es lo que llaman en Estados Unidos un public historian, es decir, un especialista en la divulgación del conocimiento histórico, de la historia. Jason trabaja como Global Fellow en el Woodrow Wilson Center en Washington, D.C. y también es profesor en el Maxwell School for Citizenship and Public Affairs y colabora habitualmente en medios como Time o la CNN. Jason trabajó durante 7 años en la Biblioteca del Congreso de Estados Unidos, donde nos conocimos en 2015, y hace 2 años publicó un libro de mucho éxito titulado History Disrupted, que podríamos traducir como la historia truncada o alterada, que examina cómo Internet, las redes sociales han cambiado la forma en que entendemos el pasado y la historia, ¿no? Porque los libros de historia, especialmente académicos, no circulan en gran número, mientras que en Internet hay contenido sobre historia que es consumido por millones de personas. Jason examina en su libro cómo esto ha cambiado la manera de entender la historia. Esta entrevista la voy a conducir en inglés, así que cambiaré ahora de idioma. Good morning or good afternoon, Jason. Thank you so much for being with us with Club Tocqueville today.
Yeah, thank you. So my Spanish is decent, not great, but I understood most of that. So thank you for the kind words.
Oh, you're very welcome. Jason, to begin with, I wanted to ask you how you came up with the idea, like how did you feel there was a need to write this book, and what is the central argument of it? What's the main point that you wanted to make with this book?
So you and I actually met when I worked at the Library of Congress, which you mentioned in your introduction. And it was actually at the Library of Congress where the idea for this book first came. On Capitol Hill, our job at the Library of Congress was to bring the research and the work of scholars and historians to the attention of members of Congress and policymakers. And the more I worked on Capitol Hill, the more I realized how big of a challenge that was. And I also began to realize that the congressional staffers, the people inside government agencies, the people inside think tanks, increasingly, they were turning to social media and the World Wide Web for their information about history and inserting the work of scholars, whether it be single author monographs or edited volumes with multiple authors or journal articles, etc., was a really big structural and communications challenge. So I began to think about the question of how social media sort of privileges and surfaces certain information about the past so that policymakers and citizens encounter it, and how it makes it so that other stories about the past never get encountered on social media. And the more I looked into that, the more I realized that there was a bigger story here to tell about how the very nature and the very designs of the platforms themselves privilege certain types of information about history, and how that actually works to prevent some information about history from ever reaching people's eyes and people's ears. And I think that's one of the big takeaways from the book, is that the platforms themselves, the cultures on the platforms, the way the platforms are designed, the assumptions that go into the algorithms, all that plays a very large role in surfacing information about history to people, which in turn then plays a large role in shaping how people understand the world and how they view events.
Mm-hmm. And Jason, can you maybe give us an example? You devote one of the early chapters of your book to the Wikipedia. And Wikipedia is often the starting point of students, well, not only of students, of many people who are interested in a given historical topic. And I'm especially concerned about the potential manipulation of Wikipedia history articles by those who have a political agenda. And I was wondering if you had any insights or examples on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the first thing that I always talk to students about is I always try to get them to understand that Wikipedia is not a neutral platform. It doesn't operate from a place of objectivity. It operates from a place of crowd consensus. And the crowd consensus can be very wrong about certain things, or it can be very manufactured to privilege one point of view and not another. Objectivity and neutrality versus crowd consensus are two very different things, but people don't often think about that in terms of Wikipedia, especially because Wikipedia has become so prevalent in all of our lives. And the information from Wikipedia lives all across the world. It doesn't just live on the site of Wikipedia. It's used to inform the captions underneath YouTube videos. It's used to inform Amazon Alexa. It's used to inform ChatGPT and the information that goes into large language models. So the information on Wikipedia has a long tail across the internet. That's the other thing to understand about that platform, is that it's, when you say people go to Wikipedia, increasingly people don't go to Wikipedia, right? They go to their Amazon Alexa, they go to ChatGPT, they go to Google, but the information they're getting is actually derived from Wikipedia. Now, in terms of how actors manipulate Wikipedia, I mean, I can give my own example from my own life. I was actually hired when I was younger to write the Wikipedia page for a very famous person, and she was very insistent, looking over my shoulder, about what I put in there and what I did not, right? So this gives you some illustration about how there are all kinds of agendas at work in Wikipedia. Some of them are personal agendas. People use Wikipedia as a PR platform, right? If you have a Wikipedia page that gives you some credibility, you manipulate that page to make sure it says all these positive things about you and doesn't say the negative things about you. But then more broadly speaking, when we think about historical events, there are agendas at work there too. In my book, I talk about how in some cases, people are writing the Wikipedia pages about historical events that haven't even happened yet. They're literally writing the history in advance because they want to frame the narrative and they want to get out in front of the story and make it portrayed a certain way.
That sounds closer to journalism than to history, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna be on a panel tonight talking about journalism. We'll see how that goes. But anyway, the moral of the story is we have to still be media literate, historically literate citizens when we go to Wikipedia. We have to understand that there are all kinds of agendas at work in these articles. And actually, the majority of articles today are not being created, they're being edited. In other words, the peak creation of Wikipedia articles happened around 2006, 2007. Since then, mostly of just people have been updating pages that already exist, which also has lots of agendas at work in it. So that's my little spiel about Wikipedia. There's much more in the book if people are interested, but it's an interesting platform to think about in these terms.
What about YouTube? You also write on about YouTube on your book. The consumption of what you call e-history, that history content on the internet is becoming more and more visual, and there are platforms on YouTube who upload videos with historical content. I'm thinking on PragerU, for instance, which is a very popular channel also in Spain. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts or insights on that, how history is affected by the fact that it's consumed in a more audiovisual format, for instance, on YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, YouTube is such an enormous platform with so much going on. It's almost hard to typify it in one way or another. I would say that, first of all, when I did this book, I did a lot of interviews. And people I talked to who were not historians increasingly told me that they didn't see any reason to take a history class, major in history, to even pay a historian to come and speak to them, because there was so much free content available online about history, not only Wikipedia, but also YouTube, right? So in some ways, when you think about this book being called History Disrupted, I think one of the things that YouTube in particular has done is it has disrupted the history economy. Because if you want to learn about the American Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, you can go to YouTube or nowadays TikTok as well, and literally watch 10,000 videos about it and feel like you never have to set foot inside of a history classroom again. So I think YouTube has actually played a very large role in disrupting the history profession and the economics of the history profession. So much so to the point that in the United States, history is the degree that has dropped the most of all undergraduate degrees. And this is happening in, we're seeing similar trends in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, and Europe as well. But, fewer people are majoring in history now than are majoring in philosophy, religion, political science, communications, and certainly any of the science, technology, engineering, and math fields. So I think history has been on YouTube has really contributed to this idea that you can learn history on your own, that you don't need a professional historian, that you can learn history from your cell phone or just from the information you get in your pocket. And what's really ironic about that is that so much of the history content on YouTube is derived from the work that professional historians do. In other words, history YouTube creators don't do their own research. It's not like they're doing their own scholarly searching inside of archives or libraries or traveling around the world to repositories hunting down information. They're reading books published by people like you and your listeners, and then they're just turning them into YouTube videos without giving credit to where they got the information. So they're literally relying on the work of scholars. At the same time, they're displacing the scholarship and making it harder and harder for scholars to do the work upon which they rely to make their videos.
Mm-hmm. And Jason, you also write about Twitter. I mean, let's call it Twitter for the sake of clarity. I know it has another name now, but you mentioned how the rapid news cycle affects the accuracy and depth of historical information that is presented through platforms like Twitter. It's often the case that a topic, because of political reasons, goes viral, and then people start sharing like historical information or about that on Twitter. But of course, the platform is very limited in terms of the amount or accuracy or the depth of the information that one can share there. So I was wondering if you could tell us something about it.
Yeah, so even before Elon took over Twitter, Twitter was one of the smallest social networks out there. I think at some point, it peaked around 340, 350 million accounts. And of course, we don't know how many of those accounts were actually authentic. There's some estimates out there that almost half of them were not authentic, that they were bots or other sorts of things. So we're really talking about a very small social network. But Twitter in its heyday had a lot of influence because there were a lot of journalists on there. There were a lot of academics on there. There were a lot of government officials on there. So because of the demographics of the platform, it sort of punched above its weight. I mean, you think about a platform like Instagram, which has more than 1 billion users, and Twitter, which has, at its peak, 330, 340 million users. That's a huge difference. Yet Twitter seems to have received so much outsized attention from academics and from journalists because that was a platform that they preferred. And I go into all kinds of reasons why that's the case. But of course, Twitter very much was a textual platform as opposed to a visual platform. And when I've talked to historians, they're very uncomfortable about doing, well, I shouldn't generalize. Many historians are uncomfortable about doing history in visual forms, but they're much more comfortable doing it in written forms or in oral forms. And so Twitter sort of allowed historians to have a platform to showcase their voice and their work and their ideas and their opinions in a format that was comfortable for them, and that also gave them opportunities to speak directly to journalists and to activists and to elected officials. Mm-hmm. My own research suggests that while there were a few professional historians who managed to break through the noise of Twitter and gain large followings and gain large influence in the United States context, one might think about someone like Heather Cox Richardson or Ibram Kendi or Kevin Cruz. For most of professional historians who are on Twitter, actually their voices did not travel all that far. I think in my research, which is not actually in the book, but has informed the chapter in the book, I think I found like sort of the median average, the median number of users for Twitter historians was something around 740 followers or something like that. So not a lot of reach, but a lot of activity nonetheless. And I think this is part of what you were getting at with your question, which is it turned out that on Twitter that 20% of voices got 80% of the attention, and 80% of voices got 20% of the attention. So it very much followed like a power law. And there were a few number of users who were able to break through and provide accurate historical information to contextualize current events, to communicate with journalists, historical information that they could then use in their stories, to engage with activists, to inform social movements. But a lot of the historical information on Twitter never reaches anybody. It oftentimes just reaches a very small number of people. And that's the case with most social media, right? I mean, most social media content doesn't reach anybody. It's just a very small percentage that actually breaks through and has a large influence. But then we tend to judge the platforms based on the small percentage of voices that break through and not on the larger percent of voices that we never see. And I think that was often the case with Twitter.
And Jason, another thing that impressed me of your book was that, I mean, it appeared in late 2021, right?
December 2021. I think it's technically listed as January 22 on the Palgrave website.
That's still almost a year before ChatGPT went viral, and still you already devoted a whole chapter to the topic of artificial intelligence and how it affects the production of history. I was very impressed by that. And since the topic is now so, has become so important, I was wondering if you could tell us something on the impact of artificial intelligence, and maybe particularly ChatGPT, although not exclusively, on the impact of e-history, the history content which is produced online.
Yeah, so when I was writing the book, everybody in the public sphere was talking about social media because this was 2019, 2020, 2021 timeframe. But behind the scenes in Silicon Valley, when I talked to tech people, entrepreneurs, investors, they all wanted to talk about artificial intelligence. And so that's when I knew that this was the next thing coming down the pike. And that's typically the way Silicon Valley works, right? They're thinking 3 or 4, 5, even 10 years ahead of where usually the public conversation is. And so it became clear to me that there needed to be a chapter about AI in this book, in part because I think I see AI as really, in some ways, an extension of social media, because so much of social media today is actually has AI embedded into it. You think about TikTok, for example. So TikTok was so successful because it integrated artificial intelligence into its algorithmic design. And because they were so successful with that, Facebook has imitated that. They've imitated that with Instagram, and now Elon is trying to do the same with X. When you think about content moderation on these platforms, for example, almost all of that is now done by machines. So artificial intelligence is playing a huge role in what is allowed to get posted, what gets taken down, what gets identified or not identified as hate speech or as disinformation. And there's all kinds of issues and challenges with that, which we could talk about. But, I think the other side of the coin is not just what AI is used to silence histories, but also how AI is used to produce histories. And anyone can experiment with this. If you go to ChatGPT or Llama or Bard or any of the big large language models, and you start asking it historical questions, you will find all kinds of creative answers, none of which have anything to do with what actually happened. I've done my own experiments with this where I've asked ChatGPT, like, who won the college football national championship in 1954? And depending on when you ask it, you'll get 3 different answers, but none of them are the right answer. Now, the companies will tell you that, we're working on this and we have red teams that are involved with troubleshooting this. And, we really care about this. So, a lot of that is public relations. These platforms are not designed to give you accurate answers. They're designed to predict language. And predicting language and giving accurate answers are 2 very different things. So I think we need to have a lot of caution with these platforms, and particularly as they continue to be rolled out relentlessly, largely to boost stock market prices and to boost valuations, not really to improve the state of public discourse in any way. And we need to fight back. We need to make sure that, accuracy and rigor and scholarship still have a place in a world where people increasingly rely on these tools to generate not only language, but also ideas and answers to questions about the world.
I'm especially, this is a bit of a digression, but I'm especially concerned about undergrads, like students, how they use these softwares, no? Because you mentioned the declining figures in history faculties, but the problem is also that students are using these ChatGPT and other AI software increasingly, and not always with enough judgment or caution, no? And we cannot just accept that that becomes the usual or the standard way of writing essays in university. Don't you think so?
Well, again, it's like part of what I talk about in the book is how there are really very different value systems at work here when it comes to the things that professional historians and scholars care about versus what tech and Silicon Valley care about, right? Silicon Valley is all about efficiency and getting from A to B as efficiently as possible. And in the minds of some in Silicon Valley, writing an essay is an inefficient thing, right? It takes a long time. It takes a long time to do research, takes a long time to write, takes a long time to edit, takes a long time to make sure you got the information correctly. So it's inefficient. So one of the things that ChatGPT and these other models promise is they promise a more efficient way to write and edit and do the types of things that scholars know take a long time. And so we need to be able to argue for the value of doing things the way we think they should be done, because otherwise the tech is going to overtake us. And as you say, this is already happening. I have a colleague who works at a university here in the United States, and she told me that around February of this year, all of a sudden her students became much better writers overnight. And it wasn't because they had actually learned how to write better, it's because they all started using ChatGPT, right? So they had taken a shortcut. They had gotten from A to B much faster using the technology than they had on their own. And you could see from a student perspective why that might make sense. And you could see from a tech and entrepreneurship perspective why that might make sense to get from A to B as efficiently as possible. But of course, from a scholarly perspective, we want people to learn how to write on their own, to think critically and evaluate evidence and do things carefully and rigorously on their own. That's a value system that we need to make arguments for if we're going to stay in this fight.
But Jason, you mentioned several times in your book that academic history produced by professional historians and e-history produced by anybody on the internet, they basically follow different values. I mean, you mentioned this in the interview as well. But do you think they are fundamentally incompatible, or is there any way they can complement and enrich each other?
Well, I think there have been moments where there's been some convergence, but I think fundamentally they're trying to do different things, right? I wrote a piece about this on my Substack at the end of last year. When you think about what Elon is trying to do with Twitter/X, just as an example, right? Elon operates from an information theory that suggests that you have to limit as much interference as possible in the messaging in order for the messaging to be as pure as possible and to be as efficient as possible from point A to point B, right? And he perceives the work of academics, of government officials, and of journalists as interference. So his MO when it comes to Twitter and X is to devalue those voices as much as possible. So there you have an example of a social media platform that is purposefully, from its founder all the way through its core now, antagonistic to the very type of work that we want to do as scholars and as journalists and as researchers, right? So it's very hard to be compatible inside of an information ecosystem that is purposefully designed to devalue your work and what you do. I mean, it's one of the reasons why doing really good history on these platforms is so difficult, because at heart, they are designed to do very different things. And in some ways, those designs are antagonistic to the values that we hold dear. Now, occasionally you get success stories like the Ibram Kendis or the Heather Cox Richardsons or the Joanne Freemans or even Timothy Snyder. There are success stories.
I don't think these success stories will be familiar to the audience, the Spanish audience. Maybe you can elaborate, or you can explain one of these examples.
Sure. Okay. So Heather Cox Richardson is an American historian. She's based up in Boston, in Massachusetts. And through a combination of Facebook and Twitter/X, she has like over 1 million followers now. She's one of the rare professional historians who has sort of broken through and managed to leverage the way the platforms work in order to get really good scholarship and history into the public domain. She largely writes about Donald Trump and the Republican Party. So her scholarship is very newsworthy, right? It's always very germane to the news cycle. There's never a shortage of journalists or other activists who want to amplify stories about Donald Trump or the Republican Party in the United States. So in that sense, she sort of has a built-in advantage because she's working on a topic that is so pressing to our current world and so resonant with the concerns of the public sphere. If you're working on 19th century quilting or 18th century Islamic literature, it might be a little bit more difficult to break through. But her topic is very resonant, is very relevant, and she's a really good communicator. She has figured out how to manipulate the platforms in order to build a large following. But she is the exception, as I mentioned. Most historians, most professional historians really struggle in these environments, not only because they may be studying subject matter that are sort of less newsworthy or less immediately relevant to the political cycle, but also because the platforms really don't privilege the types of work that they do and how they do that work. So it creates really an uphill battle, an uphill climb to marry these two value systems. And occasionally it can happen, but increasingly with platforms like TikTok and X and even now Instagram, it's very, very difficult.
So Jason, to conclude, does history have a future?
I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, people will always be interested in the past. Of that, I'm sure. And there will always be people who use the past to create content online. That seems like a given. Whether there will be enough funding to ensure that the professional discipline of history can continue to do its time-consuming, scholarly, rigorous work, I have my doubts. I would like to be proven wrong. I would like to be wrong. But right now, it seems like a really uphill climb when we look at all of the tenure track positions being replaced by adjunct positions, when we see student enrollments declining, when we see funding being cut, when we see departments being closed down or merged, and we see policymakers and people who make the decisions about where funding goes increasingly themselves relying on social media for their historical information and redirecting money towards other causes away from professional history. You know, in the United States, for example, pretty much all major philanthropies have stopped funding historical scholarship. The Mellon Foundation was one of the last ones that was still writing big checks to fund historical scholarship, and they have pulled out. So there's really only one place left in the United States that continually and reliably funds professional history outside of universities, and that is the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we have politicians in the United States who are looking to totally defund the National Endowment for the Humanities. If that was to happen, there would be nowhere left. So there's a lot of forces and a lot of things involved in creating this difficult climate for history. My argument with the book is that the web and social media have actually played a very large role in this challenge, and we need to find ways to articulate why the value systems that we hold dear and the processes for deriving historical knowledge that we adhere to still matter in the 21st century.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jason, for this fascinating talk and for the time that you have spent with us.
My pleasure.